Chapter 5, Breaking Away. The long French and Indian War had been very costly for England. The king, George II, had borrowed a lot of money. The war had been fought on American soil. Even after England won, an army of 10,000 redcoats remained in America in case the French acted up again. In 1763, the king's grandson, George III, took the throne. The new king thought it only fair for the colonies to pay for the war expenses. Where would the money come from? Taxes. In 1765, the English Parliament passed the Stamp Act. In the colonies, all kinds of documents and paper goods suddenly had to carry a stamp on them. Wills, contracts, college diplomas, and marriage licenses weren't valid without the stamp. Newspapers and playing cards had to be stamped, too. The stamps didn't cost much, but the colonists were furious. It was one thing for their own local governments to pass new taxes. Local governments were made up of men elected by the colonists, but Parliament was 3,000 miles away. Colonists had no power there. They hadn't elected any of the members of Parliament, nor could they vote them out of office. What seemed fair to the king and to Parliament on one side of the Atlantic seemed totally unfair to colonists in America. Where did George Washington stand on the Stamp Act? He thought it was wrong, but he didn't join in the protests. Parliament ended the Stamp Act in 1766 because so many angry colonists had stopped buying British goods. It was hurting trade, but the very next year, Parliament forced colonists to pay taxes on paper, paint, glass, lead, and tea. All these items were imported from England. Once again, protests in America brought about the repeal, the end of the taxes, all except for one, the tax on tea. A tax on tea may not seem important, but tea was a very popular drink in the colonies. People often drank 15 cups a day. Taxing tea made everyone mad, including George Washington. Rather than pay the tea tax, he switched to coffee. The latest round of taxes changed his feelings about being an English subject. He thought Parliament's control of the colonies was unjust. It had to stop. He wrote to a friend that colonists should not hesitate to use arms to defend their right. Use arms means to use weapons like guns. Before the wave of taxes, the 13 colonies had little in common with one another. Each colony considered itself a separate land with its own separate interests. Now, anger over the taxes brought the colonies together. It united them. England cracked down on Boston after the Tea Party. The harbor was closed. The local government was shut down. British troops moved in. No goods could come in or out of the city. Business came to a halt. Food was scarce. Still, the citizens refused to pay for the ruined tea. After all, they had only been standing up for their rights. People in other colonies sided with Boston, including George Washington. That summer, a meeting among the colonies took place in Philadelphia. George Washington was one of 6 men from Virginia who attended. The Continental Congress, as it was called, represented 12 of the colonies. Georgia decided not to come. Nobody talked about breaking away from England, not yet. They still hoped the situation would improve. But the time By the time the Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, the mood had changed greatly. Fighting had already broken out between colonialists and redcoats in a few Massachusetts towns. Americans had died. There was no turning back now. The colonies wanted independence. The Second Continental Congress began to prepare for war. George Washington had arrived in his blue soldier's jacket. He was 43 now. He had been a farmer for the past 15 years. As for his early war record, it was not great. He'd never won a field battle or ever commanded a large army. Nevertheless, in June 1775, he was asked to lead the brand new Continental Army. He said yes. Though he had serious doubts as to his abilities, his first reaction was to turn bright red, and then he ran out of the meeting.
Why did he run out of the meeting?
Because he was embarrassed. This is the Declaration of Independence. Move your hand. George Washington headed the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He sat facing the other delegates who discussed plans for war. Thomas Jefferson was asked to write it all down, the reasons for breaking away from England. Ben Franklin helped him, but the words are mostly Jefferson's, and they are among the most famous words of all of American history. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776, by the delegates at the Congress. One man, John Hancock, wrote his signature in huge bold letters. Today, if someone asks for your John Hancock, it means they want your signature. And this is a picture of the colonists in New York City tearing down the statue of King George III. And that is the end of our chapter. We're going to go back to the middle section of that chapter, which talks about the Boston Tea Party. In New York and Philadelphia, angry crowds prevented British boats from unloading cargoes of tea. On the night of December 16th, 1773, men in Boston went even further. They belonged to a group called the Sons of Liberty. Dressed in a Mohawk Indians, they sneaked onto 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. King George III was furious. He thought the colonists should have to pay for the tea and that they had to be punished.
Punished? Why?
Because they ruined all the tea.
Why?
Because they didn't want to pay a tax on it.
No, that's gross people.
That is gross people.
That's gross people right there on that ship.
Okay, the end.